Hi, I'm Malcolm Roberts and I'm in Rose Bay, Sydney with Dr. David Adler, who is President of the Australian Jewish Association. And David, you've been involved you're actually a medical doctor.
That's correct, yes. I have a medical degree from the University of New South Wales. And I've done a whole range of things in the healthcare industry. I was second in charge of the Australian Medical Association in New South Wales, and I've had input into state and federal health policy, which has been very worthwhile, very satisfying.
You were really very happy with what you've done with amalgamating the private, or coalescing the private and public sector investments in industry, medical. Yeah,
one of the important projects that I had an opportunity to focus on in New South Wales for a previous government that was headed by Nick Greiner was the subject of how to combine public and private health infrastructure. And I'd had some international experience in healthcare, and so I was able to draw that and adapt it for the Australian environment, and that led to a whole tier of hospitals, including Prince of Wales Private, North Shore Private, St George Private, Westmead Private, Nepean Private at Penrith. There's a whole tier, and that was essentially my baby.
And I've even seen a letter from, Speaker of the House of Representatives, I think, complimenting you on the work you did in leading and organising a delegation from the US House.
Yeah, I did have an opportunity, because of the international exposure, to look after a congressional delegation that visited Australia, that was headed by former Speaker of the US Congress, Jim Wright. And yeah, I showed you the personal letter, which was very gratifying. They were great people.
So people know very little about the Jewish in Australia, and that's good, because in some ways, because we never hear anyone being singled out who's a Buddhist or a Jew or a Hindu or etc. We tend to hear of only one ideology, but we might get to that later. But I'm more interested in the Jewish because, we have been accused sometimes of One Nation of being anti-Semitic and pro-Jewish at the same time.
Okay, that's a good combination.
Yeah, I know. I don't know how that comes about. I think I know why they do that, but we've also been accused of being Nazi and pro-Jewish at the same time. So it's quite remarkable, this nonsense that gets spread. Well, tell us a bit about what it means to be Jewish.
Okay, there are two separate things you're raising there, but let me tell your audience that from my experience in the dealings that I've had with One Nation, which haven't been extensive, but for us, action speaks louder than words. And we have seen zero evidence of anti-Semitism in One Nation. If anything, a little bit of the reverse. That Pauline Hanson has asked questions in the Senate about foreign aid, which has been used to the detriment of Israel, inciting and rewarding terrorism. You have singled out anti-Semitism in the Greens when you were in the Senate. And Mark Latham, who has recently joined in a prominent role with One Nation, also has a role of zero tolerance of anti-Semitism.
And his actions certainly did speak strongly.
Yeah, he had his Facebook supporters page infiltrated, and his reaction was just to close it down because he couldn't tolerate that sort of nonsense. So I understand why people would want to throw those sort of labels, any sort of labels. It happens all the time. But if you actually look at the actions, it is without foundation. If you look at the empirical evidence, to coin one of your terms, it's the reverse. What it means to be Jewish is it's part of your identity. It's part of who you are.
But is it any stronger than, say, a Christian being seen as a Christian or a Buddhist being seen as a Buddhist? There seems to be some stronger.
Perhaps it is. It's actually now detectable in your DNA. Not that defines Judaism, but if you do one of those commercial genetic identification packages, one of the markers is a Jewish marker. It is an identified marker on the DNA. So it's actually really part of the core of who you are. The Jewish identity is one of the oldest traceable identities in the world. It goes back thousands of years.
Thousands, of course.
Absolutely.
Of course it does, yeah.
From the time of Abraham through
Holy Land.
the whole thing being led by Moses, receiving the Ten Commandments, etc. So bringing it into an Australian context, when we value Western civilisation, which I'm hoping people in Australia do, despite the controversy recently, what we're really valuing is something that is built on the Judeo-Christian ethos.
Yep.
And obviously the Judeo side came first and introduced a set of values which have persisted and form one of the foundations of Western civilisation. So we actually have a very broad code to follow. Some people follow it a lot, some less. It means being a good person, being kind to others. We have a work ethic to be productive, to raise a family, to contribute to your community, to contribute to your country.
And also, you don't put down other people, and you don't say that only Jews go to heaven or only Jews will have a good life. You're quite inclusive of just about everyone.
Yeah, and we don't seek to impose on other people. And you're absolutely right, Malcolm. Part of the Jewish philosophy is not to try to recruit people into Judaism. And we believe that if you're a good person, if you have a moral code, a system of justice, various other values.
Gee, they sound familiar.
And there's a place in heaven for everyone who is good.
So you would also consider yourself very much an Australian?
100%. Australian values we support.
What do they look like to you?
We support democracy, we support freedoms, we support free speech. Free speech is one of the foundations of Jewish academic development through the centuries. We have many documented texts of the sages arguing with each other quite vigorously. And one of our principles is that the law of the land is the law. In other words, you have to follow the law of the land. So before we came onto camera, I had a chance to talk to you a little bit about the ANZACs.
And I could tell there's a lot of passion in your voice when you spoke about that.
Indeed.
Beersheba.
We support the ANZACs, and I guess that's one of the early Australia-Israel connections. Arguably the most spectacular victory of the ANZACs, which people will have heard of, the charge of the Light Horse Brigade. That was part of the ANZACs mission under British command in World War I to liberate the Holy Land. So it's set in a sequence of events that led to the modern state of Israel, the restoration of the state of Israel. So there's a great deal of affection and relationship, and if you went to Israel, to the Beersheba area, you'd see a modern little museum to the ANZACs.
You were there last year?
Yeah, there are memorials. The ANZACs are regarded with great reverence in Israel.
And what surprised me, David's actually got a large picture of that charge of the Light Horse Brigade on his wall here, very proudly displayed along with other significant items with regard to that battle. But what surprised me was just how thinly spaced those horsemen were. I was imagining thousands of horses all in one tight group, but it's not that at all.
No, they charged in three lines.
Yeah, very thin lines.
Yeah, and it was a spectacular victory. I guess, given the geographical setting, one might say a miracle.
Okay. Well, actually, there's some miracles in Israel, well and truly, in regard to technology and drought that we can learn from. But let's. What are some of the other things that you see as being part of being Australian? And perhaps I could also ask that I've never heard. I know there are very prominent Jewish people in this country, in business, in politics. You mentioned 2 Governor Generals, current members of the House. I've never ever heard of one of them saying they were there because they were Jewish or they were there to do the work of the Jewish. I see them as being Australians first, who just happen to have a Jewish faith.
Well, these things we see as synergistic. They're not in conflict at all. And part of our ethics is to work hard, to learn, to make a contribution. I'm aware that if you were to look at, for example, the welfare dependency in this country, and you can cut the 2016 census in various ways, you'd find those that nominate themselves as Jewish have a very low degree of welfare dependency. So making a contribution to the country however you can, whether it's in a leadership role, whether it's in business, whether it's in the professions, whatever it is a very important part of the culture.
I know, well, we might come to that some other time down the road. 18C, you're very strongly in favour of removing the 18C obstacles.
Yeah, that's true. I should, in fairness, say that this is not a uniformly held view within the Jewish community. There were a number of the organisations that might be left of centre that would want 18C preserved, but we think they're wrong, and that, as I said, free speech is important not only for a democracy, but it's actually a foundational Jewish value as well, that all sorts of dialogue, arguments, etc., falling short, of course, of advocating violence. I mean, we don't believe in advocating violence, but...
so you don't do jihad?
Absolutely not. Absolutely not. The preservation of life is the highest value.
Well, perhaps we'd look at something there, language, okay? Because I alluded to this a little while ago when I said we've been called anti-Semitic but also pro-Jewish. What I've noticed more and more is that when people can't mount an argument back against me or against the position I've taken, they haven't got the facts, then what they use is labels.
Sure.
And that is used to divert and also to ridicule, and it gets the monkey off their back. But I no longer let that happen, because I say, well, mate, you haven't been able to counter my argument, so thank you for confirming the fact that my argument prevails. But what I see in the language being, and that's effective, what I've seen in the language being, by calling someone anti-Semitic, I have a look at, I go back a couple of years to, a few years, to an interview I did with Ben Cubby from the Sydney Morning Herald. And he mentioned, it surprised me for an environmental editor, he knew bugger all about the UN pushing this and the UN's corruption of climate science. And anyway, he said, well, if this is all true, well, what's pushing it? And I mentioned a number of groups. We know that there are hundreds and thousands of academics who are pushing this and get grants on the basis that they find something in favour of that when there's no evidence for it. So there's a group that's benefiting from it. Then we've got people like Kevin Rudd, who raised the issue most in Australia. We've got a group of bureaucrats in the UN who are looking at this to control various aspects of other countries, and they've admitted that, and they've said that's their agenda. I mean, Cubby didn't even know that. And then I mentioned the banks, because they're pushing carbon credits and carbon dioxide trading. And Al Gore, who happened to make a pocket load out of that, and his company was on one of the directorships of the Chicago Climate Exchange, which traded this stuff. And that's another story. But anyway, so we had all of this, and I just mentioned the banks, a cabal of banks that will benefit. And then next thing, Mike Carlton, who was subsequently dismissed for other infringements with Fairfax, said that I was anti-Semitic because the banking industry somehow, he fabricated that it's Jewish. And so then he said Alan Jones is anti-Semitic for the same reason. Andrew Bolt is anti-Semitic. The Galileo movement is anti-Semitic. All this wrapped up complete fabrication. So they seem to be pushing some kind of agenda here to try and distract. And that seems to be the same with the accusations of racism, Islamophobia, what are the other ones? Misogyny. In Australia, these terms seem to be put out there to denigrate, and they really highlight a lack of argument.
Look, I think you're right, and let me, on the specific point where you were criticised, criticising the banks is not anti-Semitic any more than criticising anything else. I mean, I think that's ridiculous. Until you mentioned it, I wasn't aware that you had been singled out for that.
It didn't bother Alan Jones either.
And Alan Jones and Andrew Bolt, and we would regard those as friends of the community. It's just nonsense.
And to top it off, the founders of the Galileo movement, one of the two founders was the son of a Jewish mother, and the other founder is married to a Hungarian Jew who escaped from the Holocaust at the age of 2. It's just stunning that some of this crap that people...
There is another family that's invested in the climate change that you've omitted, and considering recent events, we really should not fail to mention the Turnbulls.
They make a lot of money out of it.
And Alex Turnbull is on the record as being invested in the renewable energy market. So the more that climate change is pushed as a political agenda, why that's not a conflict of interest, given what's happened in the Liberal Party recently. And of course you're sitting here in the heart of Wentworth, where it was made a major issue in the recent by-election. I think they're much bigger questions to answer.
We could talk about that. But what you want to see is get the message out there that there is a conservative force in Australia, and it's well needed.
Well,
protecting Australian values. What does conservative mean? It means protecting the Australian values.
We have seen a drift to the left in our institutions. It's happened in the universities particularly. It's happened in the media. It's happened, I guess, in the Liberal Party. And it's also happened in the Jewish community, no different to any other aspect of Australian society. And a group of us in Sydney and Melbourne particularly were getting increasingly uncomfortable with that and decided to do something about it. It was in the planning stage for 3 years and subsequently launched. So we're across the whole range of conservative political issues, family values, Australian values we've mentioned, democratic values, religious freedom obviously is a specific one. There are security issues that we need to be able to talk about in this country, and perhaps a good thing that, if you want to call it a good thing, that came out of the recent terrorist event in Melbourne is that the Prime Minister actually called out
at last
violent, extreme, radical Islam, whatever order he used the adjectives, but he actually did call it out, and he should have credit for that. Hopefully he'll follow through with actions. So these are all issues of interest to us, and we think it's important that those that are on the conservative side of politics have a proper voice in the process and defend our values.
You mentioned in our pre-talk that some statistics around the people in Australia's the terrorist cohort within the Goulburn Maximum Security.
Our convicted terrorists, those that have actually been proven in the courts to have been guilty of actual or attempted terrorism, and there are 20-something of them, are locked up in the Goulburn Super Max prison. That's their home. Now we know that approximately 2.5% of the Australian population are Muslims. I believe that of the cohort that are convicted terrorists in Goulburn Supermax, 100% are Muslims.
So no Buddhists, no Jewish, no Hindu.
And there are other people in the Supermax prison who got there through because other avenues. Crimes, they might have been violent drug dealers or involved in a bikie gang or something like that. But of the actual convicted terrorists, currently locked up in the Goulburn Supermax. So how does the 2.5% become 100%? It is impossible to argue the cliche, this has nothing to do with Islam. Now, I mean, we always have to say that the majority of Muslims are not terrorists, the majority want to be peaceful, but to deny that there is a real problem in the ideology is just to deny reality.
And when the Labor Party comes out and talks, and especially the opposition leader comes out and talks about, this is Morrison's comments being, undermining unity in this country. I mean, all Morrison did was tell the truth.
Indeed. And
at last.
Look, this is an issue, although it's not PC to put it in these terms, I will. It is of a specific concern to the Jewish community.
Mm-hmm.
We see what happens in Europe, and as everyone knows, there's been a major increase in Muslim migration into Europe in recent years. There was a study
It's actually more than migration, it's almost colonisation. It's in big ghettos sometimes.
So, you mentioned at the beginning of our discussion the issue of anti-Semitism. Well, let me put it in perspective for Europe. And I won't make it up, I'll quote a major study that was done by the University of Oslo that was over a 10-year period and collated all the anti-Semitic events they could find in 7 countries over a 10-year period. So it was a massive study. In 6 of those 7 countries, the largest single factor of violent anti-Semitism were the Muslims. I mean, that's just the result of the study.
That's not surprising.
So we are very concerned about the future in Australia. We want to live peacefully. We want to make a contribution to the quality of life in this country. We want to support Australian values, and we need to bring in people who are not going to be in conflict with those values. How we do that, that's up to people like you, the politicians to sort out. But the security and linked with the anti-Semitism, we see what's happening in Europe, we have to learn here.
Perhaps we can get on to something more positive, and that is that when I travel in the outback in Queensland, and even in New South Wales, I've heard people say we have got a lot to learn from Israel when it comes to drought-proofing our country. Because Israel's on the edge of a desert, or is it actually in a desert?
Well, a lot of it is arid. I mean, it's not a single climate through the whole country. It has, hilly areas, it has a coastal area, and it has a large desert area as well.
But it's fairly arid. And what I've been recommended to do is to learn more about Israeli agricultural techniques, because they make excellent use of water, very, very efficient use of water. Can you give us some of the examples?
For sure. I'll give you 3 off the top of my head. One is, of course, the famous micro drip irrigation systems which are used in Israel. They're not just tubes with little holes in them. They actually monitor the conditions of the plants, and they have computer controls which directs the micro irrigation to those plants that need it. It's very sophisticated. The second thing that's done there that I think we could learn from, and we're still waiting for our first compliment from the Greens for this particular feature.
Don't hold your breath.
Water recycling.
Yep.
Of the domestic water in Israel, the proportion that is recycled is 90%.
90%.
90%.
And the next highest country?
The next highest country, I believe, is Spain, which is 20-something percent.
So Israel's leading the world in recycling.
By a mile.
And this is not just recycling. This is not recycling of human water for human consumption. It's recycling of human water, wastewater, for agricultural consumption.
Correct. They have over 30 reservoirs, so that after the domestic water has been used in people's homes, it is processed and stored in reservoirs for use by the farmers, for agriculture, for irrigation. So that's a big deal. And the other thing that you'll see there as you drive around, particularly in the arid areas, I guess the cliche is making the desert bloom. There are thousands of huge commercial greenhouses. So the greenhouses retain the moisture, the irrigation system. They have vertical farming up wires and things, and for example, the vegetable yield per square metre can be as high as 10 times the normal agricultural methods. So it's intense farming, concentrated, and of course that requires very efficient use of the water. They drill down in the arid areas, and they might find brackish water. They process that and use it for the farming.
They use desal plants a lot in Israel?
Yes, there are some large desal plants as well, ones that actually work.
Been built for good reason, not nonsense.
Yeah. And Israel is now a net exporter of water. Exports water into Jordan and into Gaza.
Gee. The other thing is, you mentioned Jewish people have a high value for work ethic, very high work ethic. I'm thinking now, I saw a presentation recently on Benjamin Netanyahu's speech, and he outlined that, I think, Facebook, Google, Apple, might have been Apple, I'm not sure about
Apple, Yahoo.
Some of the world's leading companies in IT, in high tech, Intel, yes, have got R&D centres in Israel.
They do, and as you drive around, you'll see modern buildings with the famous logos of those companies. I don't know if you've heard about the BDS, those that hate Israel. There's a group that
tell a story about that later.
Boycott Israeli products. Well, my advice, if you want to do BDS, please do it properly. Throw away your mobile phones.
Yep.
Throw away your computers that have Intel chips. Don't use Google or GPS navigation, etc. But on the NASDAQ in the US, second to the US companies, the country which has the highest number of listings on NASDAQ is Israel.
On the American high-tech stock
NASDAQ,
exchange
correct.
Is Israel.
Number two.
What's the population of Israel?
8.5 million.
So it's 1/3 Australia's population.
Roughly, yeah.
And what percentage of area?
Oh,
I don't expect you to know that.
We are about
it's tiny.
Roughly 1/3 the size of Tasmania. Israel's about 1/3 the size of Tasmania.
Gee. And with a pretty harsh environment.
Yeah.
And made it productive through industry.
Yeah. And look, if you haven't been there, this is now the tourist plug. Obviously, you'll see the most ancient aspects of Western civilization. I mean, both the Judeo and the Christian side began there. So you go into the old city of Jerusalem, you can have a look at the archaeology. This is where it all began. And then you'll see the most modern aspects of our society. You don't have to worry about mobile phone reception anywhere across Israel. It works. And all the companies...
We only need one tower. They're the size of Tassie, come on.
If you do. But the technology works there. So that, you go to a bus stop. It's not like our bus stops. There is actually a digital display which tells you, which is tracking the buses and will tell you exactly how many minutes until your bus arrives.
Oh, we've got an app for that.
Yeah, okay.
What percentage of Israel's population is Jewish and what percentage is Islamic?
Roughly 1.5, 1.6 million Arabs.
Most of them Islamic?
Yeah,
so that's about
20%.
Yeah, 150.
20%. And although there are pockets of problems within Israel, the proof is that the bulk of those Arabs want to live in Israel. It's not like they don't have other choices in the Middle East. And if they didn't like the lifestyle in Israel, it's very easy to go to any of the surrounding countries. There are 21 Arab countries in the region. There are 56 members of the Organisation of Islamic Cooperation. They've got many, many choices, but they choose to stay in Israel. And they're judges, they're doctors, they own businesses.
So they're not suppressed in any way, and not held back. They're all given equal opportunity.
Absolutely.
The members of Parliament,
yes.
Some Islamic members of your Knesset?
Knesset, there are about a dozen.
Out of how many?
Don't know. Less than 100.
Less than 100. It doesn't say 12%. Okay, so it's
70.
Okay, that's a fair representation.
Yeah. It's not much different to the proportion of the population, and in all walks of life, you'll see the Arabs involved.
And people from all over the world living in Israel, correct?
Obviously the Second World War was highly disruptive to the Jewish community, and also the suppression in the former USSR. So Israel held itself out to be a sanctuary, and many of the Jews who survived the Second World War have gone to Israel, and a fair few that have escaped from the former USSR ended up in Israel. Interestingly, and we talk about refugees. There are no Jewish refugees in effect.
I've never heard the term. These days, anyway.
Yeah. In 1948, when there was the War of Independence for Israel, there were roughly 750,000 Arabs that were displaced, and roughly 850,000 Jews that were kicked out of the surrounding Arab countries. So not far different in the number of refugees. 100% of the Jewish refugees have been resettled in Israel or elsewhere, but most of them in Israel. Israel took a view that it would look after its brethren. In contrast, for political strategic reasons, there are a proportion of the Arabs, in 1964 they became known as Palestinians, they weren't prior to that, who had a refugee status imposed upon them. There is enough space and enough money, particularly in the Gulf states, that they could quickly solve their whole refugee problem if they wanted to. But there are political strategic reasons why they don't want to.
They maintain it.
And that is essentially to drive the jihad against Israel.
How many democracies in the Middle East apart from Israel?
0.
That's what I thought. Israel's the only democracy. So I can understand why 1.5 million Arabs want to stay in Israel. But the other thing that I think, good lesson for Australia, is that Israelis believe in rule of law and they believe in discipline and orderliness, because they wouldn't be here if they didn't have that orderliness and that ability to work together. So while they'll work with anyone, they are very strong in enforcing law and order, aren't they? I'm not, when I say strong, I mean rightly strong. The fact that they stand up for their laws rather than, I don't mean any forms of overbearing imposition of order.
And there is a separate system of justice. There is a separate, police and courts and the whole works. And indeed, the courts are very powerful, and sometimes they will make decisions that the government is uncomfortable about. So it is true, vigorous, independent judiciary, and sometimes that's controversial.
And the Israeli democracy is pretty vigorous democracy. You've got a lot of people internally, Jewish people, who are on both sides of the fence on many issues, and they're not afraid of speaking out, and they don't go and cry for a safe spot when someone raises a topic that's touchy. They hammer it out right there verbally. It
is a very vigorous and dynamic democracy. In some respects, you could say it's even more democratic than Australia. For example,
excuse me, but just a minute. Political correctness has destroyed democracy in this country. But keep going. Sorry.
There's no single political party that can form government in Israel. I mean, it's both a strength and a weakness. it is a multi-party system, and what typically happens after an election is that the party that has the most seats falls short of a majority. The last couple of elections, it has been the Likud party led by Benjamin Netanyahu, who's the Prime Minister, and they have to negotiate coalitions. And sometimes they'll have to negotiate coalitions involving 2 or 3 other parties in order to get them over the line for the majority, and then they go to the President and say, we're ready to form government.
Is there a second level below the federal Knesset?
There's no state system.
Too small.
But they have powerful local government. So it's 2-tier rather than 3. So the largest and perhaps most important of those would be the city of Jerusalem. So the mayor of Jerusalem, which is an election just being held in the last few days, is a very powerful position. It's more powerful than our local mayor. It's sort of somewhere between a mayor and a premier, as we would understand it in Australia.
Do the Jewish people, I mean, you've had centuries of murder and victimisation, really barbarous acts perpetrated against the Jewish people. Is there a sense of vulnerability there, or does it depend upon the country in which the Jewish live?
Well, I think the culture is by nature optimistic.
That shines through, especially when you see it in Israel and the Jews I know here.
You couldn't survive if you didn't. But you're right. I mean, the Spanish Inquisition. There have been times when England was very unfriendly to the Jews. There were pogroms done in the former USSR, and of course the most prominent in modern history was the Nazi Holocaust. But every time the Jewish community has bounced back. But it does create a sense of vulnerability in some respects. I guess that's why we're watching closely events in Europe. France, where there has been a spike in specific anti-Jewish terrorism, there is a net emigration of Jews from France for the last few years. They go to Israel, they go to America, other Western countries.
France's future doesn't look good.
Well, some people say that the fate of the Jewish community is a bit like the canary in the coal mine.
Yeah.
When things start to deteriorate, it's a sign for where the country is going in terms of its freedoms and liberties.
So that raises another interesting contradiction for me, because the Jewish people are obviously very much in favour of freedom. And yet there seem to be many Jewish people on the control side of politics, on the left-wing side, because the left-wingers are ultimately controllers. They want to get control, they want to change things to get more power. So the left-wing are control freaks, and beneath control there is always fear. And when we see someone make a statement such as I've made, such as you've made, and people label us for it but can't argue against it, then they're trying to control us, they're trying to suppress us. Why is it that such a freedom-loving people are so heavily invested in the left, the control side of politics?
I think they've lost their way, to put it bluntly. We see this perhaps most dramatically in America. Not so much in Australia, but in the US, in the last couple of elections, the majority of the Jewish community voted Democrat. Yeah, that is a very valid
because the Democrat Party is no longer the Democrat Party.
But if you look at the Orthodox Jews, those that might go to the synagogue on the Sabbath, who follow the Jewish culture perhaps a little more, most of those have voted Republican. So we do see that split. You look at, and you then survey them and ask, what are the issues that are important to you? You find that the issues that we've been talking about amongst the leftist Jews rank very low. So we would say that, you know, they identify as Jewish, but they've lost their way.
Okay. Another thing, perhaps we could have your thoughts on religion. As I understand religion, man has always had a quest to understand, these days you've got to say men and women, but humans have always had a quest to understand where we've come from and what we're about. Okay, so some of the earlier religions tried to provide an answer to that question. And that's the kind of thing that many people these days are losing touch with in religion. But the other side of it, religions have provided a strong code of values, code of ethics, standards to live by. So the Jewish people seem to be very strongly religious, but they're not dominating other people. They're not trying to spread it. So they believe in that freedom of expression, religious expression. They also believe very strongly in a code of values. Can you expand on that?
Well, perhaps the code that is the most famous, that came from the Jewish people, you know, you'd recognise as the Ten Commandments. That is the first widely documented code. There was actually one before it, which is called the Noahide Laws. But most people are not so familiar with that. The basic Ten Commandments, most of which make sense, form until this day a foundation for our legal system.
And when you say our, you're not talking about
no, I'm
Israel
talking Western,
or Jewish,
Western.
You're talking about Western civilization.
You go to the Supreme Court of the United States and you will see an engraving of the Ten Commandments at the building. This is very important. And it's also something which has been elaborated on through the ages. There's hardly a moral or legal question that you can think of that hasn't been researched, debated, documented.
You've been around a while.
It's very, you know, it's all there. So the learning that we are obliged to do is never ending. There is such a depth of wisdom that has been built up over the centuries on a whole range of issues. So yes, times change and technology changes, but there are some values that we think are important. There are values that have been adopted fairly universally across Western civilization. It hasn't been the case for all civilizations. There have been times when murder was not a crime.
The sanctity of life wasn't important to those
Correct.
people.
Correct. There have been civilizations where that was just not an issue.
So it's very interesting for me that, it actually makes complete sense that a group of people values freedom and therefore wants to protect freedom. And that's what I've seen in Israel ever since I was young. I've seen a country that protects its freedom. And sometimes that's required some pretty strong force.
Yeah, look, it's amazing that, and it has required strong force when you consider the odds against Israel in terms of numbers around. Some people would call it a miracle that the country has survived and has won conflict after conflict after conflict.
And it's got a long history. It's not as though Israel's only a few years old. It's got thousands of years of history, and
there is
the modern expression.
There is archaeological evidence right through the land of Jewish settlement going back thousands of years. Some that people will have heard of almost universally. The Dead Sea Scrolls, which are a couple of thousand years old, record writings from the Torah. We see it all over the country.
Okay. Perhaps we can come back to your primary love, which is love of this country, Australia. What are your concerns for the country? What are your hopes for the country? And what would you like to see in the future for our country?
Well, I don't think our hopes and concerns are different to anyone else.
No, that's what I'm putting. As an Australian, what do you see as your concerns?
We want what we described as Australian values to be available. that people have the freedom to reach their potential, that they're not suppressed by political correctness. The Australian concept of a fair go is very important. We think that government should be small rather than overwhelming every aspect of a person's life. There are some very legitimate roles for government, and one that's being challenged at the moment, of course, is immigration policy, which will set the sort of country we have going forward. So there are some very important debates to be had. We want to participate in the debates and make a contribution and keep Australia as good a place to live as possible.
Okay, thank you very much. And just one question, I don't know if I'm being rude in asking this question. What does the little cap that some Jewish people wear, what does that signify and why is it worn?
The kippah is, I guess, a form of identification. It's basically...
So it's like a Christian wearing a cross?
It's basically to remind us that there's something above us. There is a higher power.
I can identify with that.
Yeah, so that's all it is. It's important to say that we don't seek to impose Jewish customs on anyone else, but want to live in a society where you are free to practice your own little bit of cultural habits.
So that's why you're very happily Jewish and Australian.
100%.
Thank you very much, David.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.
Thank you so much.